will. Okay. Welcome, everybody. Pardon the Zoom mess, and thank you so much for joining us for this 5th meeting of the ADU Advisory Committee for the City of Denver. What we've been doing the last couple of meetings, just to be able to get to business as quickly as possible, is not going through introductions fully, but making sure we had a chance for the elected officials to be introduced. And then anyone who is new or we haven't seen before on the advisory committee, which I don't think is anyone. And then we just have been getting into business. If everyone could please make sure, which I think you all have, as we do every time, to note your name and affiliation or neighborhood on your Zoom name tag, just by going to the participants tab on your Zoom, on the bottom of your Zoom screen, and clicking on it and renaming yourself. Thank you so much. And my name is Ryan Bolton. I'm with the Consensus Building Institute, and we'll be facilitating the meeting. And one thing I wanted to ask you all to think about, and I think we'll just do this in the Zoom because we lost a few minutes joining, but it's, we're in August. And one thing, as you think about kids going back to school and wrapping up trips and just transitioning the seasons, one thing that you're really looking forward to, it's sort of great to hear where people are, what's going on for folks. So just maybe put in the chat one thing that you're really looking forward to, whether it's this month or this week or this upcoming season. I'm personally looking forward to my kids going back to school, no offense to them. And so thank you for doing that. One thing I just want to say in terms of noting what we're doing tonight is you'll remember that back in June, what we recapped a lot of the issues that folks had been highlighting over the previous couple of months in terms of constraints to building and designing ADUs in Denver, to making them equitable, challenges, issues on your minds as sort of experts in the different neighborhoods and parts of the community. And then in June, we spent some time starting to hear from the staff about ideas and different tools for tackling those issues and getting your input on those possible tools and approaches. And so tonight, we're going to do part 2 of that. So before we do that, I wanted to give an opportunity to just welcome, I think we have Councilman Herndon, don't we, on the call? I'm not sure which elected officials we have, but go ahead and introduce yourselves if you're here, and I will take a look. All right, well, I saw that Councilman Herndon was joining, and I'm hoping that he is able to come back. Oh,
I see him in the attendees list. He might need to get
he
promoted
still
again.
Needs to get moved over.
Sorry, Councilman.
Sorry, Councilman, we're moving you over. We tried this before, and for some reason it didn't go through. That should do the trick. And while we're waiting for him to be moved over,
I'm here. I apologize. I had to leave and come back, so I apologize. Chris Herndon, District 8.
Thank you so much. No apologies needed whatsoever. Okay. Any other elected officials on the call tonight?
And I'll just acknowledge that we have our planning board chair, Joel Noble, is in the audience as well. And Joel's been following this really close and has a lot of great ideas. So thanks for tuning in, Joel.
Welcome, and thanks for being here. And in a minute here, I'm going to explain to just a reminder for the members of the public who are here how this is going to work for members of the public as well. Okay, so just a quick check-in on the agenda and format. You have a sense, hopefully, of the purpose of the meeting, and you saw on the agenda that there's several topics that we're going to specifically focus on tonight. And the idea is to give staff a chance to sort of frame what they're thinking in terms of potential approaches to some of the issues that have been laid out and discussed by you all, and then have 15 minutes per topic, more or less, to hear your input, what you're thinking, how it sounds to you, other ideas. We're gonna, before we even go into that, we're gonna recap for you just a reminder of what was discussed at the June meeting. And there have been 2 focus group meetings in the interim between June and now. And so we're gonna hear just a summary of what came out of those 2 focus group meetings and what they were. And then toward the end of the meeting, we'll talk about next steps, what to expect. There's going to be a public open house coming up. So we'll get to that at the end. For members of the public and the audience who are here, throughout the meeting, you have a Q&A that's devoted to you, and the city is monitoring that. And so any questions that you have just during the meeting, feel free, don't hesitate to ask them on the Q&A in the Zoom, and staff will get back to you in real time, just so we can have a conversation that way as well. And then at the end of the meeting, we'll have 5 minutes for public comment, and we'll just open it up. So be thinking, if you're in the audience, of any comments that you might have or questions, and make sure to raise your hand toward the end of the meeting and we'll get to you. In the meantime, thank you so much for putting all the things that you're looking forward to in the chat. It's so great to hear and see. And I think with that, Josh, I don't think there's any high level things to say that I missed, is there? Before we turn to
I think that covered it all.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Abe, I think you were going to give us a quick recap from the last meeting in June, and then we'll go to Libby to hear about the focus groups. Is that right?
Yeah, let's kick things off. Sorry for the delay, and thanks everyone for returning.
Okay, so hi everyone. For those of you in the audience not on the committee, I'm Abe Barge with Community Planning and Development. I just realized to get demerits for not putting that in my Zoom ID. I will do that as soon as I'm done talking. Just wanted to provide a little bit of a recap of what I think was really good discussion that we had in early June on the first roughly half of the main issues that staff really wanted to talk with the committee about. So they're all listed here, and just a little bit of information on where we think we are with those things. So Josh kind of color coded them, with the green things being like, you know, we think we have pretty clear direction. That whatever that other color is we might need to talk about it a little bit more, or we're doing a little bit more evaluation on it. But with minimum lot size, I think, you know, there was a lot of discussion about removing the minimum lot size standard for detached ADUs. So really, we're just looking at what that might mean for smaller lots, and for
come to church. Yes. And then
sorry, I'll just, there we go. And just kind of how that relates to what might be feasible for development on the smaller lots on which you'd be able to build ADUs if the lot size minimum was removed. Height and stories, we do have a little bit more work to do on this, but, you know, obviously had a lot of discussion about the 1.5 story height limit being confusing and potentially increasing costs, causing some unintended consequences. So we're heading in a direction where we'd look at just allowing for the full 2 stories. Need to kind of figure out what to do in urban edge. And then we'll talk about this a little bit more, I think, in the meeting. And Josh is going to bring it up when talking about the, or Libby, when talking about the suburban focus group. But, you know, I think this group had some unease with the idea of just limiting detached ADUs to 1 story in the suburban context, which is an idea that we'd heard and put out there. But we're still potentially headed in that direction. We'll tell you why. Bulk plane and height, looking at a little bit more flexibility, especially on narrow lots. Building covered exemption, pretty clear that we should look at making it more about people than about cars. And setbacks, I think we do need a little bit more work and discussion there. And it also depends on kind of where we land with some other things. So we'll talk about that more. Reuse of existing structures, that's when you have an existing garage that may not meet all the ADU rules. We do think, you know, there's pretty strong support for looking at additional flexibility there, that when you have something that was permitted as a garage in the past, some time ago, making it easier to do a conversion.
Okay, thank you. And I think we were going to turn to Libby to get just an update on what the focus groups have been talking about and how it bears on tonight's meeting.
Yeah, so I'll cover the suburban context focus group anyways, and then Josh will cover the architecture one. So since we last met, we did hold a suburban focus group meeting on June 16th, and it was attended by advisory committee member Donna Rep, along with 8 other folks. And Josh presented a brief overview of ADUs, what they are and why we're doing this project. And then we spent the majority of the 2 hours just listening to participants' concerns and answering questions regarding ADUs in the suburban context. We didn't really hear any surprises, but rather the focus group participants confirmed what we've already heard from the general public, and that people in suburban areas are particularly concerned with ADUs casting shade on their property, as well as infringing on their sense of privacy. And this is partly because many of our suburban neighborhoods lack alleys. So an ADU located only 5 feet from an adjacent property line feels really in your face. And we spent a lot of time talking about whether changes to the rules regarding height and setbacks would help alleviate some of their concerns. And we heard pretty clearly that ADUs should be limited to a single story in the suburban context. In fact, it seemed that if we reduced the allowable height to 1 story, that folks would be okay keeping the minimum 5-foot setback as is. We did mention that we could potentially increase the setback to 7 feet, but people thought limiting the height would be much more impactful than increasing the setback. And meeting participants also liked the idea of requiring landscaping to help screen views into their property. And there was also some discussion regarding whether or not we should be regulating window placement and configuration in order to keep ADU tenants from looking into the neighboring home. Finally, we heard some concern regarding parking, particularly if someone was converting an existing garage into an ADU, which would result in a loss of parking. Fortunately, we didn't hear as many parking concerns as we may have anticipated. So that was the gist of our conversation. And as Abe alluded to later on in tonight's presentation, Josh will further discuss reducing the height of ADUs in suburban areas. But we do have a couple minutes now if anyone has any questions or comments regarding this focus group. And I noticed that Donna, you are here tonight, so feel free to share your thoughts as well, particularly if I missed anything.
Yeah, I thought it was a good focus group. There was a lot of input. It was good for me to listen. And I thought that a lot of the questions that had come up, we had already sort of addressed and hashed out. But again, I did really appreciate listening to the concerns that they had, and it's very much in sync with things that I've heard thus far from my neighbors just in Southwest Denver. So I thought that was a real interesting grouping of people from all over in a suburban neighborhood. So thanks for including me.
Thanks for attending.
And thanks for chiming in. And I see, Gosha, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick question. How were the participants of this focus group selected?
Yeah, it's a good question. They were all potential candidates for this group. They signed up with interest on our interest form on the website, and they had identified themselves as living in suburban contexts and creating those concerns. So we've essentially found some of those folks through this process, through some of our public outreach. We've also reached out to some of the suburban council offices. So Councilwoman Black's office was instrumental in reaching out. So yeah, through the process, more or less, is how we've heard of their interest.
And also, I think, like, if you, Gosha, or anyone else know of folks who just are interested in ADUs in general, or have a particular interest, like how ADUs would be built in a suburban neighborhood, let us know, and also encourage them to sign up and express interest on the website, because as Josh said, that's kind of how we're putting together the groups.
When you say, I see Debbie's got her hand up, but in the meantime, just a quick question, Abe and Josh, can you say anything more are you anticipating more groups when you say, feel free to have people express interest? I know it was discussed at the June meeting at the very end, focus groups and who you anticipated being in those and which ones you anticipated convening.
Maybe, Josh, I'll defer to you. Like, I think we're kind of playing it by ear a little bit on the conversations that we need to have. But what do you think, Josh?
Yeah, I think, we have a public meeting coming up next. And so I think we're going to move to that step and see where we are with some of the proposals and see if there's interest or, more concerns, more interest in if any particular topic needs more focus. We're definitely open to meeting in a more focused capacity.
And what I'll do is in the interest of time, I think I'm going to go to committee members and then members of the public. If you're and audience, if your questions have not been asked and answered already toward the end, please keep them or put them in the Q&A for now. Ozzy, I just saw your hand up, but did it go down? Is it still up?
Yeah, very quick. Was there any discussion, any concerns about attached ADUs in the suburban context? Since you can build a pretty huge envelope there, so it would be pretty easy to do attached.
Yeah, certainly. We had those discussions. So showed examples of, attached versus detached and what could be built versus not. And yeah, we had some good dialogue around that. And so the setbacks, the height differences, etc.
But probably my read was less concern. As Libby said, there was some concern about parking, and of course, that's a concern regardless of the ADU location, but otherwise probably less concern about attached.
Yeah, the attached setback would be, 15 feet from the rear, up to 20 feet, and so much greater distance. I think the concern comes in with the detached product being potentially 5 feet setback at the rear, maybe 7, and so that's where we really heard that setback becomes, really important aspect, especially if the height is allowed to be greater than 1 story.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Libby, for the recap of the suburban focus group. And there was one other focus group that met involving architects and architectural issues. Abe, were you gonna touch on those takeaways?
Right, I'll go for this one. We also met with architects and builders. So we reached out to the AIA, American Institute of Architects here in Denver. And so, every architect that's registered in the state essentially is involved in many ways. But we convened a group of, 15 architects and builders, designers of ADUs, and had a lot of great discussion about some pretty technical things. A lot of kudos given to this committee. Some folks said that we've actually hit 9 out of 10 of the issues that they were really worried about when they're building ADUs. And so kudos to you and everyone here. Thanks for all your great input. We heard a lot of things about, other issues that are slightly outside of zoning topics and things that are not specifically scoped to be addressed in this project, but we will look forward to putting out a, internal paper committee to work towards some of these things. But things like the fees, the design fees, the permit fees, there's always cost associated with those things, timing on project review. The city's busy with a gigantic backlog as far as residential review permits go. And we heard a lot about those issues that, architects are really feeling. People want these housing units to come online now as soon as possible. And, the longer it takes to get reviewed, the construction costs go up and all those associated things. We heard a lot about some of the hidden fees like the SUDP sewage tap fee that could be upwards of $5,000 whenever you need to add a sewer line, water tap fees, things like that homeowners aren't necessarily aware of until they're actually submitting to those permits, and looking at what we can do internally, cross-departmentally to hopefully find a way to reduce those fees or roll them into something greater. Lots of building code issues that people come across, and a lot of those things are, there for a reason, life and safety, engineering. We're not looking specifically at changing any of those in this project, but some of the zoning issues that we became more aware of are things like the idea of an exterior balcony. A lot of folks that are building ADUs are very interested in being able to use that space, have some sort of exterior space for their tenants or their mother-in-law, whoever it may be, adds to the quality of life. We currently only allow like a stair landing as a balcony, as an exterior space. So it's not technically allowed to be a habitable space per se, but if you have an exterior stair, you're only allowed to have enough room to actually navigate a door opening. This sort of, begins to kind of incentivize this idea of just doing an interior stairwell for a lot of builders. But then that kind of eats into your precious square footage of the dwelling unit. So looking at maybe creating some sort of allowance, maybe a small square footage allowance that could be a balcony, could be a larger landing. There was this idea that maybe if only the exterior space, balcony, deck, whatever it might be, if it were facing the rear, facing the alley, could that be an idea that's worth exploring? Could that be sort of liberalized in a way? And a lot of that issue kind of stems from the 1.5 story limitation. It's the fact that, we make you build this space that you can't necessarily use or access. And so a lot of that could be changed if we move context-wise to 2 stories, full 2-story allowance. And so we'll see. We're definitely interested in those ideas. We heard some things about like the maximum building length. We do have a 36-foot maximum length in the code. We heard that, on really large lots, it's really not that necessary, or it feels a little bit arbitrary. Maybe, a 38-foot ADU could be the better result or product, and felt like it was limiting in a lot of ways, especially for unique lots. ADUs on corner lots, we've heard a lot about issues with the bulk plane there, how you have to set back the unit quite a bit further from the street, where a better result, better urbanism would be to allow that unit to be a little bit closer to the street, give them a little bit of a presence and access to the side street. We've heard a little bit more about livability. Every square foot really does matter when it comes to these units to bring down the cost. You're essentially putting in a full kitchen and a full bathroom regardless. And so it costs more or less the same to do a 400 square foot sort of dollhouse as it would basically 1,000 square foot kind of single story ADU. So looking closely at what we can do there to make them more comfortable, more livable, hopefully more cost effective. And we did ask them about some technicalities around the single story ADU limitation. If, the suburban context, we think is starting to move that direction. The current allowance is 17 feet in height for a single story garage. We wanted to know if that was appropriate still as an ADU, if it was necessary. What's the appropriate height in feet for a single story structure? And we heard that it does work well in order to fit mechanical and have a little bit of attic space and some storage and have a little bit of flexibility in your single unit, your single story dwelling. So that's some of the technical things, but we'd love to hear some feedback from you guys. We had 5 members from this panel on it as well. And so if any of you guys have any additional thoughts or things that I might have missed, please do chime in.
And just a reminder that, the purpose of the focus groups is really to go deeper into some of the topics that you all have raised, obviously flag anything that maybe fell through the cracks, which mostly has not, and then bring it back to you to mull over, to opine on, to factor into your thinking. So that's the idea. Does anyone who was there have anything to add or emphasize, anything that stood out to you? Or anyone who wasn't there have any questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I think, what Josh said there at the beginning about 9 out of 10 of the major issues, the committee already talking about. I think it was really nice to hear that feedback, from everybody that was in that group. The one thing that I guess we did kind of get into a little bit was talking a bit more about the ADUs being accessory to duplex units and potentially row houses and that. And I know that as far as, I think that that's something that's really good for us to look at as a committee, just since that's really what's pertaining to the zoning. I think we got into a lot of stuff, like you mentioned, Josh, that, maybe isn't necessarily looking at the zoning code and what we can change with this committee, but and it almost just seems like it needs to be 2 different topics, really. it's like, okay, how can we remove some of those barriers around some of the costs and the permitting and that? But then as this group, how can we really make some of these zoning changes that are necessary to make ADUs more affordable to build and, easier for, the public to know what they can build and what they can do with these ADUs. But I thought it was a good meeting.
Thanks, Sarah. Naomi, please go ahead.
Thanks. Did this builder group include prefab builders, or is there going to be a focus group for prefab?
Yeah, not specifically. We have some folks here. I think, Tara is really involved in prefabrication processes. She was part of the committee as well. I mean, a lot of the architects are interested in the idea, but not a specific manufacturer, I don't think, of prefabrication.
Naomi, is there something in particular that you want to make sure is specifically considered in more depth outside of the advisory committee context, or any elaboration?
I think they face, or I've heard from builders that they face, particular issues in making prefab or modular units really at scale in Denver. And there's also been some incentives or, push at the state level to do housing innovation and more prefab and modular. So it'd be interesting to, again, it might not be the focus. I don't know if I don't remember those barriers necessarily being zoning focused, but I do know they face specific barriers, and prefab and modular is probably always going to be a bit cheaper than stick built. So it's just something I want to make sure keeps being highlighted as we think about reducing barriers to ADUs.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Any final comments or questions about this particular focus group and the input here? Okay. All right. Thank you. So it's helpful going into today's conversation because there.
A hand up.
Oh, the hands just went up. Great. Rosemary, please go ahead.
I just have a quick question. So
Yeah.
the suburban focus group, is the architects focus group going to continue meeting? I suggested somebody for this particular group, and somehow that fell through the cracks. So will this group, the architects focus group, continue meeting, or was it just one meeting?
Yeah, great question. We talked about meeting again with them to sort of test some ideas once we have proposals. And yeah, we're certainly interested in welcoming any other folks that are interested to participate through that architect, builder lens to continue those discussions.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I had one other comment.
Go ahead.
Just seeing some of the things in this architects focus group, I was looking at some of the Q&A from the public, and early on, Joel made a suggestion that basically we separate out zoning issues from other barriers, things like water, sewer, tap fees, things like that. So maybe just like a down and dirty list, so we can clearly see the different kinds of barriers. And Joel, at the end of the meeting, or he can put it in the chat if he wants to clarify that a little bit, that'd be great. Thanks.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And just to note, Josh, so if there's a possibility that focus groups are going to meet again and people have suggestions for folks that may be interested or should be included, that I assume they should just email those to you, put them in the chat to you now.
Yeah,
or call you. Okay.
Sounds great. Yeah.
Okay. Gosha, go ahead, and then we'll move on to the topics for today.
Yeah, thank you. In the architects group, any discussion about pre-approved plans or kind of standardized design, pattern book, or any discussion along these lines?
Yes, definitely. This one, a lot of interest, a lot of interest in this. And so we are excited to get to that level too. I think that's going to be more of the implementation phase of this project, so we really want to make sure that we know what the rules are, right? We want to get this figure out what can be built. And in the months, following adoption, we'll gladly get with the AIA. There's a lot of folks interested there that want to, volunteer some time, do some design work, and get some pre-approved plans going. We're looking at potentially creating some master sets internally to go that direction. WDRC has done a lot of work figuring that out on their own. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of momentum there.
Can I be included on the future architects focus group?
Definitely.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would second that as well. I'd love to be included on that group also. And I guess I had a comment just in general after Gosha's comment about the master planning approval process with the city in general. I think that's something that we should probably talk more about, because I know, I've been involved with WDRC and Habitat's master documentation, and the master plan set was originally what we wanted to move forward with, and it wasn't really able to happen. So I think it would be great to talk about, approval sets or sets that are already approved for people to move forward with. But I think in general, talking about what that master approval process looks like would be a good thing to add to the list of things.
Definitely. Yeah, I think we have some work to do internally to sort that out. But, post beyond the scope of this project, we want to get the zoning rules down. So let's figure out what can be built first and certainly implement that.
Great. So it sounds like Chelsea and Gosha would both be interested in being on that group. Okay, going forward. All right, thanks everybody. So I think we're gonna transition into the substance and focus of tonight's meeting, which is these 4 remaining topics where the city has done some thinking and wants to get your input on some ideas and possible tools. So one is owner occupancy. The other is suburban focused issues, and they'll talk more about that. ADUs in duplex and row home contexts, and ADU square footage allowances. So again, we're gonna go through these, and staff Josh is gonna frame what staff is thinking, and then we'll spend 10 to 15 minutes getting your input and comments, and then we'll move to the next. And those of you in the audience, please chime in on these too, because we'll be reviewing the public comments as well. And you're always welcome to email Josh and submit a comment on the city's website. There's a link for that too. So I guess with that, Josh, I'll just turn to you.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. So as Abe mentioned, we've already discussed 6 of these big ticket items. We thought that these 10 items sort of became the biggest things that would kind of move the needle towards removing barriers to ADUs, but also creating that context sensitivity we're looking for. We know, obviously these aren't the only 10 issues. There's lots of little things embedded in between, but we feel as staff, helping us answer some of these big ticket items really helps us decide on some of those smaller things, and we can bring forth those further details as we move on. But so the 4 items we're going to discuss today, Ryan mentioned, first one being this idea of owner occupancy. We've heard a lot from other cities that are implementing ADUs that owner occupancy can sort of become quite the barrier to ADU development. If you want to see more ADUs built, you need to allow people the flexibility on their property, a little bit of assurance, some confidence in what they're actually doing. So the issue that we have today is that if a homeowner builds an ADU and has to move for whatever reason, that accessory dwelling unit then becomes illegal. It's no longer an allowed use on that property. And so that dwelling unit, the ADU, must either be decommissioned, its habitable status must be removed, or the property must be sold. And if you have tenants in that dwelling unit, they potentially have to move out unless the property transfers hands. And so I've got a good graphic here that helps explain it. It's still a bit nebulous, and hopefully we're all on the same page here. But to clarify, if you have an ADU and you live on your property, you can rent it out. You can use that space as a personal office, as if it's an extension of your own home. You can also live in the ADU and rent out your primary structure as a rental. But as soon as you no longer live on that property, as mentioned, the ADU use is no longer allowed. And so that unit does need to be decommissioned, or you sell your property to someone that will live there permanently and that use will apply to them. Decommissioning, means taking things out that actually cause it to be a dwelling unit. So you could have to remove a kitchen stove appliances, cut off a gas line, remove, restroom utilities and things like that. whatever it takes to then create a structure that is no longer actually considered a dwelling unit. We hear some concerns around, allowing this thing. So staff's grappling with the idea of, looking at both sides and the pros and cons. We want to open up the discussion to you guys to see how do we feel about it. But we want to ask some questions like, are we sort of giving ADUs a hard time? What other properties around the city have this sort of requirement? We hear this concern that doing something like this would open up more short-term rental opportunities, which, we feel like it would not actually increase the opportunities for short-term rentals, as a short-term rental license still needs to be licensed directly to the permanent and primary resident of that home. And so I guess in theory, a tenant could rent out an ADU and short-term rent it out, but only if, or like rent the entire property, I suppose, but only if the landlord, that they're renting the entire property from allowed it to do so, which feels pretty rare given all the liability. So you as the property owner would be sort of giving your tenant the responsibility to manage an Airbnb in your property. And so it doesn't feel like it's opening up any new opportunities for short-term rentals by changing this regulation. But there's many other arguments against, against why allowing non-owner occupied ADUs to exist. Some people fear that it might lead to speculative development. It could potentially open up the opportunity for distant landlords, corporations to buy properties, potentially add an ADU to it, and then rent them both out as long-term rentals. We've heard a lot from certain RNOs, like the University RNO near DU, that's worried that the entire property will just turn into student housing, as many properties have. They're using primary dwelling units today for 4 students to live in there. The fear is that suddenly you'll get 6 students living on that property, which hints more towards the need for housing, if anything. But there's also a lot of really compelling arguments for allowing non-owner occupied ADUs to exist. It does allow more of these housing units to be built, so it does allow more ADUs just to exist generally. People don't have that worry about the future of their property. If they have to move out, don't have to tear it down. I'm able to own a property that has an ADU and not live there full time. It would prevent some displacement of people that are living in ADUs currently. It does give those property owners more flexibility. So we know that there's plenty of local landlords today that own multiple rentals in the city and are interested in adding more housing, potentially adding ADUs to those properties. And we've also heard that it actually encourages a lot of homeowners to reinvest in their property. And so if you're looking for a way to stay where you are, but would love to get some rental income, an ADU is a good way to do that, to keep you on land, on your property. And so we'd love to open it up to the committee and hear your thoughts. I think for us as staff, our proposed approach is that it does meet the citywide housing goals to actually keep dwelling units online, not to actually decommission an existing dwelling unit. And also as a way to help prevent displacement. We don't want someone moving out having to remove their tenants from an ADU just because of an owner occupancy requirement. So let's discuss your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you.
So I guess before we open it up, does anyone have any questions about what's being proposed before we get input? I see Sarah and Gosha's hands up, but are either of those questions about like what's actually being proposed? Okay.
Yeah, I do have one question that I just want to clarify. The only context where we have owner occupancy requirements currently is in the single unit zone district. Is that right? And I apologize if I missed the first slide with the context on that.
That's correct. Yeah. Single
Okay.
unit.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay. Anyone else? Is this clear? Is the question clear? Okay. Gosha, please go ahead and feel free to clarify what you understand as the question and what's being proposed, and then your thoughts about it.
I think what's being proposed is removing the ownership occupancy requirement, right? Is that correct?
Yeah.
So
Yes.
I think I would agree with it. We've discussed it, but I'm trying to look at it kind of in a practical sense about the decommissioned ADU. Like, has that actually been done before? Like, and how would that be enforced? The inspector would come and inspect the property, making sure that the livability features that I guess have been removed. Seems very cumbersome and not likely to actually be implemented and followed through. So it seems like it's kind of a requirement that probably exists, but I'd be hard pressed to actually see how it actually works in real life. And I want to comment on the speculative development. I mean, it's already happening, right? I don't know that there's any data or any reason to think that ADUs would encourage more speculative development, but we do need more housing. And I wonder, the question I would kind of pose, so what? Like, it's already happening. And why wouldn't we want 2 units, smaller units, as opposed to 1 unit? I think 2 units is better than 1. So
Thanks,
those are
Gosha.
just my thoughts.
Yeah, so I guess Josh and city folks, any comments on that? I see one comment that Chelsea's agreeing with Gosha, but any responses before we turn to Jenny?
I'll just note that, yeah, Gosha, you're absolutely right about the enforcement. A real challenge that there isn't proactive enforcement of the existing owner occupancy rule. It has come up a few times with complaints when inspectors were required to follow up, and then it's discovered that this is happening. And I think there have been a couple of ADUs decommissioned because of it, but it's not widespread. I assume that there's plenty of cases where owners aren't living there and we just don't know about it.
Thanks, Abe. Any other comments on that, Josh, before I go to Jenny?
No, I think you're right. And I think, what we've heard about speculative development is that, yeah, it's difficult for a distant corporate entity to actually find the profit margins to do something like this on a parcel. An ADU being expensive price per square foot. It's not a quick and easy win that they're looking for. There's a lot of, financing issues associated with it, and banks have issues, trusting that these are true dwelling units. And so even property owners have issues finding financing for these structures. And so, yeah, there's a lot of nuance there that it's not a quick and easy win for a speculative developer. I think you're right about that perspective as well.
Great. Jenny, go ahead. And then there's a interesting comment and question from Naomi in the chat that we'll go to after that.
I don't know that my question or comments particularly well formed. I'm just thinking about this bullet point of allowing non-owner occupied ADUs would potentially prevent displacement of folks. But I'm thinking even without this rule in place, if I as a homeowner move and I've got someone living in an ADU in the back, what happens to that relationship when I've moved? Do they get kicked out? I mean, I don't feel like there is necessarily a protection for these renters, no matter what this occupation of the primary resident rule is.
Yeah, that's exactly our concern. Yeah, so your ADU use would be illegal, and so technically that would not be a legal dwelling unit to where you couldn't have tenants there. So you would have to remove your tenants from that structure, decommission. You can move them into your primary home, I suppose, if you wanted to.
But I guess also what I'm saying is that if I sell my house, I would be also selling my house and the ADU, and the subsequent owner of my house would have to still want tenants there. Right? I mean, that they are not, if the property changes hands, they're still not necessarily protected.
Sure, yeah. I mean, that's like, hopefully you would negotiate with your tenants that you're selling the property before you moved out, right? And help find them a place to live, or
Yeah.
that's with any right transaction with tenants involved, I suppose. But
Exactly. I guess that's just what I'm saying, is that there's no protection or threat simply by having this owner occupancy rule in place, that you could get a new owner living there that still doesn't want to have a tenant. So
sure, it's their
put it out
property,
there.
right?
If we were trying to protect the renter in some way, there'd need to be another layer of protection for the renter.
Josh, correct me if I'm wrong, but I was assuming that the conversation was revolving around the situation where a homeowner might move off property but not sell.
Correct, yeah. Right, exactly. I mean, we can't protect tenants' rights through an ADU, but yeah, this is the idea that if you moved off of your property, you would, for work, right, you had to relocate to Seattle and your primary home's here in Denver, but you have tenants, you have an ADU. Suddenly you want to keep your home in Denver, you're going to move back in 5 years, but then you would have to kick out your tenants. The use would be illegal if they're in the ADU. They're not allowed to live in that structure. The use is no longer allowed. And so we're trying to prevent situations like that where people are trying to keep their property, expecting to move back, want to own, the same house that they've grown up in and lived in their entire lives, things like that.
So I see a couple hands up, and I think we'll go to Suzanne next. I just to point out that Naomi in the chat said that, she's less concerned about speculative development than inadvertently incentivizing corporate ownership, but also would encourage looking at peer cities just to see, for those that don't have owner occupancy requirements, have they had negative consequences? It would be great to have data on this. And Abe responded that you have talked to Portland and a couple other experts who have found this not to be lead to speculative construction, but there's sort of that question about is more data available in addition to probably anecdotal.
Yeah, we'll look for some literal data. Like, agree, it would be great to just know that a study in a city that is more flexible about this has been conducted, and that they know exactly who owns what and what the pattern is, basically, so we can see.
Great, thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, they would certainly make it easy for us, right? But yeah, that data is hard to come by, unfortunately, with property changing hands and ownership requirements and things like that.
But we'll put it in the meeting notes in terms of that being a request, and that can certainly be something that's out there and documented. There's a couple more comments, and then I'll turn to Rosemary to kind of wrap us up here. But yeah, from Emily, from Tara, advocate for removing the restriction, and from Renee that we need residential units, so we should remove any barriers. So in any case, thank you for the notes in the chat. And Rosemary, go ahead.
Okay, I'd just like to clarify to make sure I understand this correctly. So Josh, you mentioned early on, it seems to be a pretty rare thing that an owner would move off-site, but keep the house, rent out the house. The person or the owners of the house, the renters of the house, could use the ADU for a short-term rental. Is that correct? Do I understand that correctly?
They could not, no. Oh, you mean under current rules, or if the owner occupancy rule were changed?
Current rules.
Under current rules, no. But if the owner doesn't live on the property for any reason, they've even moved right next door, the ADU is no longer legal.
So if a person moves off site, they would not be able to both rent the house and rent like a long-term rental in the ADU for two separate renters. They could not do that, even a long-term rental.
Can't do anything with the ADU at all.
Okay, got it.
Not today, yeah, the ADU can't even exist technically.
So I see Gabe's hand went up, and and we do need to move on to the next topic, but it does sound sort of resoundingly like there's support for removing this restriction so far. Gabe, do you want to chime in?
Better unmute myself. So if we're looking at ADUs as a tool for affordable housing, and that may not be the ultimate goal, but if we are looking at as a tool, then it seems like removing the occupancy requirement would allow for 2 rental units to be available, but not necessarily affordable. So to me, it's almost, if the owner occupancy is there, then the accessory dwelling unit, which is an accessory to the original primary dwelling unit, that would seem like that would be a possibility of having that being more affordable than removing that and then having 2 rentals at who knows what the price is going to be. Because I mean, I live by rentals and their prices go up all the time, and the maintenance is kind of lowly kept. Whereas if there's an owner there, it seems like the maintenance and the consistency is a little bit more in line with the structure versus a rental unit. So that's kind of where I just kind of have a different feeling about it.
Thanks, Gabe. Yeah, it's useful to have sort of countervailing thoughts about this, and questions about is there data out there to any of these questions. Okay, I do want to wrap us up so we have enough time for the other issues, but I know there's a lot of interest. Donna, I see your hand is up. Can you do it quickly?
Yes, I can. Gabe,
Okay.
that's exactly resoundingly for my neighborhood. Neighbors are concerned about people not having a vested interest in their neighborhood. So if they scoop up a bunch of properties and then make them all rentals, that's a big problem for the neighborhood. So I'm pretty solidly against this, just based on the feedback that I've received.
Against lifting the restriction.
Against lifting the restriction.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, that's really helpful just to hear from a couple of you about possible reasons against lifting. But Josh, Abe, Libby, is there anything else you want to ask before we move on, just knowing that we do want to move on, but just for purposes of today? Okay.
No, I think that's all great feedback.
Yeah. Really great. Okay. Thanks, everybody. I think we're moving now to, the suburban context. Go ahead, Josh.
Okay, yeah, thanks. So as we mentioned at previous meetings, and hopefully, with our suburban focus group, we discussed it heavily, but we do need to create more suburban context zoning districts that actually allow ADUs. So currently on the books, we just have this one district for all of our suburban districts. Well, it's 3 technically, but only 1 single unit district. And so that's the SSU F1 district that's highlighted here. This is the current page from the code. So if you haven't had a chance to look at the code, it's riveting, and this is what it looks like. Suburban detached ADU building form page. This lot size is designated as, one particular lot size being of 8,500 square feet or greater, with a zone lot depth minimum of 150 feet in depth. And so there's plenty of interest in expanding suburban ADUs, as we are tasked to do so in this project. So we need to create those districts for those other lot sizes. We know that the most common lot size in the entire city falls around this SUD size. And so here's just a quick array of, what some of those lot sizes look like throughout the city. Regardless of context, it's, the code works through A through all the way to I. We have lot sizes that are that large. And so they're broken out into sort of these segments of how big they are, how wide they are, rough square footage. So only the F exists today. We need to create that sort of SSU A1, SSU D1, whatever exists in the real world, what's mapped on the ground. We need ADU rules that are associated with it. And so we wanted to give you guys a quick glimpse of sort of the direction we're heading with that, what that might look like. And based on some of the feedback that we've received from the suburban focus group committee. We can look at some of those proposed rules. Here's just highlighting the idea that that SUD lot size is our most common parcel size citywide. We've got about 53,000 of them. Of our, it's roughly half of all of our single unit parcels citywide. Most of them do fall in the suburban context. And so the median parcel size of that lot size is not quite 7,000. So just under that 7,000 square foot threshold, which, as we'll look at later, kind of allows that medium tier ADU. So up to 864 square feet of an ADU. Many of them are greater, but this is the median. So here's a quick glimpse as what the code might look like in the future. And so we'll have to change the zone district, create these districts, add to them to the zoning code, add this SSU A1 allowance, the D1 allowance, FI, things like that, FX. There's some nuance there with different nomenclature, but the idea being that this is what an example red line of code will look like. So in the future, in our future meetings, as we actually have full proposals, we'll see something like this in draft form, bring to the committee to confirm. It's hard to see on the screen, but we can zoom in here. So you can take a look at when we create that district. We've had pretty clear guidance that the height in stories should be limited to 1 story. So in all of our new single unit suburban districts, A through I, looks like we would lean towards a 1-story structure that can be up to 17 feet tall. We would look at removing that zone lot size limit, as we've talked about in previous meetings citywide. So no one would necessarily be ineligible from building in detached ADU. And we're also looking at just potentially keeping the setbacks where they are today. So similar to what you can build as a garage today, you'd be able to place a detached ADU in that same location. Based on some of that focus group feedback, we've heard that the height really is the issue with privacy and the most concerning factor. And so we can open this up for discussion. We'd love to hear some feedback about what you guys think. What does the direction in the suburban context feel like? I know there's a lot of opinions either way, but love to hear from you.
Great, thank you.
Can I ask a question before?
Yeah, Gosha, go ahead.
Yeah, so you're creating these districts. Would you also map them and implement them, or would they just be districts that people could rezone to?
Yeah, so this project is not scoped to rezone any properties in the entire city. So it's not a citywide rezoning. We are creating the district so that property owners or city council members can come forward with legislative rezonings to rezone as many parcels as they feel necessary. But yeah, we're not scoped
No implementation. All right. Okay, thank you. That's helpful.
Yeah, we're getting the zoning on the books so that people may come forward and request the zoning for their property.
Okay. Are there questions or comments about this? What do people think? Yeah. Okay, it looks like Renee, go ahead, and then Ozzy.
I have a question. If what's on the screen is that's only removing the minimum lot size in that zone district and not all the other zone districts?
No, sorry, we're just looking at the suburban context for this example. So we've discussed previously removing the minimum lot size citywide in all contexts.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, this is just the suburban.
Yeah, it's not an option to that. Okay.
You got it. We're just looking at the one suburban context regulations right now.
Okay.
But yeah, thanks for that clarity.
Ozzy.
I think this would be really interesting to look at in the context of specific sites. I think the suburban lots tend to be more shallow, like our urban lots tend to be 120 or 125 feet deep, whereas suburban is often under 100. And so I think we might want to look more at that rare 35% lot location rule, because on a shallower lot, that gets to be more and more restrictive. And it sounds like the focus group heard that people want it pushed more away from that back property line. So, maybe if it could move more toward the front of the site and further away from the back of the site, people might be more comfortable with that. I think the other thing to keep an eye on is that the suburban zone districts allow really high lot cover. Like you have these huge lots and you're allowed to build 50% total lot coverage. And so that could end up with, kind of shockingly large build outs. So I think the ADU square footage limit you had down at the bottom of the page, while, we don't, I feel like the committee hasn't really loved those square foot limits for the urban zone districts or the SU zone districts. Those might be pretty important in the suburban context, and you might actually want them to be a little on the smaller size, because it's actually possible to build 1,000 square foot ADU if you have 50% lot cover on a gigantic lot.
Does anyone else want to chime in on that idea or that thought?
Yeah, good thoughts. I mean, we do have examples here. So this is showing about 1,000, square foot ADU pad on that lot size. So you get a sense of scale. But yeah, these are showing, deeper, more urban appearing lots. You do get funny shapes in suburban, and those are all good things to consider.
I guess I would have the question, can you build a 1,000-foot garage on those same lots?
You can today, yeah, that is your allowance.
So if it's 1 story, the question is are cars that much more preferred rather than housing people in 1,000? I mean, I don't have an opinion on it. I'm really just thinking about.
Sarah, I saw your hand go up, and then Naomi's going to chime in.
My one question or comment is, I understand the 1 story that we're looking at here for this context. And the one thing I'm just thinking, if somebody has, like, I understand it more if it's like you're all surrounded by 1-story houses. But if you have a 2-story home in the front, or, the houses around, are we limiting it too much by putting the, having it only be, 17 feet tall and just limiting it to the 1 story? And I know in Arvada, they do have, in their guidelines, you can't go higher than the front house. So if it's a one story in the front, then it can only be 1 story in the back, or, 2 stories. So I don't know. I don't have just wanted to kind of bring up that point. Yeah,
it's a good thought. And you can always do attached, within the primary building form. So you could do 2 stories if it's attached to the primary structure. And so I guess it's not limiting it entirely per se, but for the detached form, we've heard that those privacy concerns are so great in the rear yard, having that presence with a shallower setback potentially, that 1.5, 2 stories just did not feel appropriate in that context.
Sorry, I muted myself. Sarah, looks like you have a question or comment. Go ahead. Did I mistakenly see your hand up?
Oh, sorry. That was all. I was finished.
Okay, I thought
Maybe
it was
on 8, please. Maybe.
Okay, I thought it went up again. Okay. Mary, yeah, go ahead, Mary.
So I have a question. In my neighborhood, our covenants and HOA rules say that you cannot build a 2-story home, cannot remodel or change your home to be 2 stories. So do those rules count more than these, or how does that work?
Sounds like we're going to need a lawyer involved. Well, I mean, this is limited, the proposal here is 1 story, so I don't think you would come up against that, but But yeah, I mean, the zoning rules are what they are citywide. Your zoning allowance is 2.5 stories on your property, but obviously covenants and agreements that have been signed are what they are, and they're not necessarily up for us to
Right, they're
fight.
it's two separate sets of regulations. There's the, the city rules, the zoning, and then the contractual rules in your community that you may have, well, you did buy into, I think, when you agreed to buy there. And that's like not going to be enforced by the city. But if they say that you can't build a 2-story house, I'd be pretty surprised if they let you build a 2-story ADU. So I think if the zoning rules limited an ADU to 1 story, then they're just going to be accidentally in alignment, the zoning rules, with the contractual rules that you have in your HOA or your covenant.
Naomi also just put a note in the chat that Suzanne brought up Regis and other neighborhoods near universities have similar concerns, and it may be useful to specifically look at markets near areas with high demand for student housing.
Is that about height, you're saying, Naomi?
No, I think we're still having a little conversation
Okay.
about the owner occupancy requirements.
Oh, that was still on that.
Yeah, no, we're still on it.
Okay, thank you. I know there is like a little mini conversation going on in the chat about the owner occupancy and gathering data, and yeah. Okay, good. Thanks for the
Sorry,
clarification.
we'll move on.
No, you can stay with it. I wanted to make sure that we brought in anything that was relevant to this suburban question, but we can also move on. We do have a couple more topics to get to, but does anyone else want to opine on this one before we move on to the next?
Yeah, any major concerns about the potential direction we're looking to move on suburban contexts?
Okay, great. All right, Josh, I think we can move on to the sort of row house duplex question.
Okay, yeah. So looking at ADUs with 2-unit, multi-unit uses like row homes, we are also tasked with Blueprint Denver language here that we're implementing. So under our recommendation, letter B, part of our guiding principles here, the revised the Denver zoning code to allow ADUs as accessory to more uses than only single unit homes. So as many of us know, hopefully all of us know today, that the accessory dwelling use is only allowed as accessory to single unit. And so we're looking at what does it mean? What does it look like whenever you can have an ADU as accessory to a 2-unit use or a multi-unit use, which 2-unit means, a duplex building form, something you can think of like that. Multi-unit means 3 or more units. And so looking at row homes, buildings that are split up into more units like that. And so thinking a little bit more about this context and how many properties are affected and where this exists. Here's a map of all of our row house parcels citywide, as well as our 2-unit parcels. And so we've got about 26,000 of these parcels citywide. These are parcels and not zone lots. And so each 2-unit parcel shares a zone lot with one other. And so it's a little tricky to think about, how big it is as far as a lot, but you can think of these as dwelling units essentially. So around 26,500 dwelling units citywide. And they sort of vary throughout the context as well. So lots in urban, quite a bit in urban edge, a little bit less in some of our suburban context districts. But thinking closely about what that means, we're really trying to consider what that would look like, what would the end result be, and what shall we create as the allowance. And so thinking about 2 units, so these are duplex structures. So each one of these would be separate zone lots. So we're looking at 3 zone lots, 6 parcels. First project is what exists today, typical duplex layout, garage at the rear, 2 units in the front. Then in the middle, looking at potentially a 2-unit ADU product where you have a detached version with parking below. Parking is required in 2-unit and greater districts, and so parking will need to be factored in a lot of these results. And then looking at something more of like an attached possible ADU layout. So the top version being if those units were smaller than the primary, we need to consider, what the outcome will be. We'll have to write the rules around this. Currently, we're considering something similar to what our rules are for the allowance outside of single unit districts for ADUs. That rule says that 75% of your GFA of your primary use can be the size of your ADU. So if you have a 1,000 square foot primary home, that means you can have a 750 square foot ADU. We've got a lot of other, regulations like lot coverage and things that would prevent larger ADUs than that, but we'd love to get some thoughts and direction on where this is possibly heading. Similarly, we're looking at when they're accessory to row homes as well. So similar to duplex, row home being 3 units or more, a multi-unit use. Here's an existing example of what's being built today, some newer row homes. This is 12 or 15 units on a few zone lots, but you can see the parking is at the rear doing the garage units. We want to ask the question what could the future look like if ADUs were allowed to be accessory to those units? So at the bottom here, we're looking at the example of that product. Then in the middle, detached versions, you could potentially place ADUs on top of those garages, creating 5 more dwelling units, as long as it complies with whatever setbacks, regulations, etc. that we have involved. You could also see something like attached versions. So each row home could potentially have an attached ADU is associated with it. So possibly a separate entrance, different level, things like that. We're considering something similar. So a percentage of the primary use, possibly 75%. We're not sure if that's the right number, because it could be quite large, but as mentioned, there's a lot of other restricting factors on the site as well. So we'd love to give your thoughts here and any guidance you have for ADUs as accessory to 2-unit, multi-unit.
Great. I see Tara's hand went up, and also just a note that I can imagine for those of you who are not expert in this particular part of, ADU land, that you may have questions, and Jenny put one in the chat. That'd be great to clarify a little bit, but go ahead, Tara, let's go to you first.
Yeah, thanks. Josh, just a quick question. If you back up maybe one slide, not that one, but the one, this one. What if, let's say, and this is kind of maybe getting to where Jenny was going to, what if the owner occupancy rule actually, which only applies to the SU district, so it doesn't matter. So say someone owns a duplex but doesn't live in it, and they want to build an ADU at the back as a 3rd unit, so they don't want to build 2 ADUs at the back, would that be allowed? You're on mute, Josh.
Yeah. Josh,
Sorry, yes. Yeah, I mean, if the property owner owns the entire thing, yeah, I think you're allowed to. You would be allowed to have as many of those structures as you would like. It's a good question, but yeah, we'd figure out.
That's kind of the confusing one, though. If they sold in the future and sold to 2 separate property owners in the front duplex, who owns the ADU? I could just see it getting messy, so there might need to be some clarification around that.
Yeah, I mean, you could alternatively, live in one side of the duplex. You build an ADU, your neighbor doesn't, right? And so,
yeah,
it could be 2 separate property owners. It's tied to, the parcel, the property owner, whoever is the.
Okay, but so you would
parcel.
you'd only be allowed in that case to build on half of the back lot. The property's still divided. I see. Okay, makes sense.
Thanks.
I think you could also remember that you're not allowed to sell an ADU separately from the primary use, which we haven't talked about changing. And I think, from a staff perspective, I kind of think we shouldn't. But what that means is that, there's this scenario where you own the whole duplex, like both sides. You could build an ADU on one side only, like above the garage, and then sell both of the units But basically the ADU that's behind the one unit is going to sell with that unit, not separately from it or with the other unit. It's going to just have to be on the same ownership parcel.
Yeah, it's all tied to the ownership parcel.
And Ozzy, your hand went up, and then Rosemary. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, nice work on the diagrams since the architecture group looked at them. And looking at this one, I feel like we're still in like the middle one seems like a no-brainer. It seems so appealing. It seems like it would be so good for the alleys. And then the one on the left or the top feels exactly like the slot home fourplexes that we were getting on 50-foot wide lots up until the slot home rules changed. And I would love to find a way to make the middle outcome possible, but make the left-handed outcome less possible, while still allowing some option for attached ADUs in these conditions.
Interesting. Yeah, so both Josh and I were pretty involved in the project to address slot homes, and actually do technically think that even the one on the upper left is consistent with the outcome of that, in that you still have the two street facing units. So it's still like, you maybe don't see any difference from the street. The side-by-side thing is happening back behind there, which is, still possible under the updated regulations, where you can build the townhome building form, which is what was created to address slot homes. But interesting concerns.
And there's a couple folks agreeing in the chat. Rosemary, go ahead.
So Ozzy actually stole some of my thunder here, because I was going to refer to the slot home issue also. So I think with this, it's the same thing. It would be really great to see data from other cities, because there are unintended consequences, like what happened with the slot home with the garden court form. Developers taking advantage of that and turning it into the slot. So when you're collecting data, please collect data about this and other cities as well, and how other cities have dealt with it.
Okay, thanks. And I just saw Naomi's hand go up after some comments in the chat. So Naomi, I was going to highlight one of the things you said. So go ahead.
Just on this note, I don't see the issue, I guess, that's being brought up here. First of all, this is just massing, and I guess maybe I'd like to hear a little more maybe from the city about, the building forms, right? So slot home was an advantage taken of building form requirements. Here we're just talking about what number of units can be allowed in a building, however that building decides to be built, but that building still needs to obey a building form, correct? So whether it's row home or townhouse building form, it should from the street look exactly in many ways like duplexes or row homes do today. I mean, maybe there's another entrance, but I just wanted to raise that.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, that's one I would like to mention. Yeah, so the thing on the top left, you just turn the color white and you could build that today as a duplex, right? It's your primary allowance. And so the question is adding another kitchen and another bath to the rear of that, does that change the outcome? Does that change the massing? I would agree with Naomi. I think it doesn't per se, but the use is what changes the use of that property.
Thank you. All right.
Whereas the middle lot and the orange in the back, that's a bit of a different situation. Like that would be a new form allowance to build the detached ADU back there that doesn't exist now. But otherwise, right, you're just changing what's happening within what you could already build as a form.
Yeah, so any attached ADUs do have to fall within the primary building envelope, which, all three of these front structures, duplexes do. And so
I know that there's a lot of interest in this. I see comments in the chat and 2 hands up, and we only have 15 minutes or so for the last 2 topics. So Gosha and Ozzy, your hands are up, but if there's any way to put anything in the chat, please do. And otherwise, go ahead and we'll just be brief, if that's okay.
I'll try to be brief. I think as I'm fascinated by these diagrams and I try to digest them, and I actually really like the top one. And also another scenario that we're not looking at is kind of a top and bottom split of a duplex, to where maybe there's a basement unit in half of the duplex, which also another great option. I definitely wouldn't discount the top option. I also think probably the middle one is the least likely to happen as a retrofit. I mean, it's possible as a new construction, but as a, if we're talking about preserving the front of the lot, and presumably there's existing duplex that we would like to preserve, I mean, that would require scraping of the garage and probably building a brand new structure. Whereas these attached forms create a new opportunity, because I do see somebody could split their duplex and carve out another accessory dwelling unit within it. And so I would really encourage exploration of these options, and I love them.
Yeah, thanks. That's good thoughts. We talked closely with some of our building review, and it becomes complicated when you do, stack units as far as building code. And so that we felt as if maybe practically it was maybe more of a result, something you would see like this. It's much harder to retrofit, right? Go back and kick yourself into a multi-unit dwelling versus something more like a row home, fee simple product. But yeah, possibilities.
Great. Okay. Thanks everyone for the really substantive comments on this topic. I assume at the end, in a minute here, I think the city is going to sort of wrap up what they're hearing from all of you and what they plan to do with all of this input. So stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, we're going to go to one more topic. And then if anyone has on your mind any topics that are real issues that you don't feel have been addressed, put them in the chat and we'll see if we have a few minutes to touch on them before we do a wrap up of the issue. So yeah, go ahead, Josh, square footage allowance.
Yeah, okay. So last thing we wanted to touch on was just this overall ADU square footage use allowance. So we do have rules around, what's allowed based on lot sizes and tiers, and we're looking closely at, do those make sense? What's being built? What should be allowed to be built? What feels appropriate? We're tasked with providing housing options, and we need more 1 and 2 bedroom homes. We're really asking the question, what's livable as a 650 square foot ADU? Can you actually squeeze 2 bedrooms in there? It feels comfortable. WDRC has a product here. You can see the floor plan of a 650 limited ADU, which, you can squeeze 2 bedrooms, but not a lot of living space otherwise. You're kind of in the kitchen or the bathroom. And does this really provide, the housing option for families, for family housing? We've heard a lot from the architects, the builders, from you guys, and public. The costs are pretty comparative as far as you're already paying for a full kitchen, already paying for a full bath. The framing, other things, are kind of negligible. Roughly, the parcel area that allows a 650 ADU is less than 6,000 square feet, and we're seeing about half of all of our ADUs built to date, 48%, just a little bit less than half, are falling in that parcel area. So it is a popular place to do so. You guys brought it up last committee meeting, the idea that, garages can be 1,000 square feet. Why can't an ADU just citywide create that allowance? Which, it's a good thought, brings up good points. We do have language in the code that describes accessory use limitations, this idea of what does it mean to be accessory. And so an accessory use must be clearly incidental, subordinate, customary to, and commonly associated with the primary use. That is to say, you're not supposed to allow an ADU to be 2,000 square feet when your house use may only be 1,000 square feet. It doesn't feel subordinate in a way, but there's thresholds there. Your primary use allowance could be much greater, but we really want to take a look at what makes sense here and if it's worth pushing on that and deciding what that intensity of use can be. So currently in our single unit zone districts, the ADU square footage use allowance is broken down into those 3 thresholds based on lot size. So 650 being the smallest, the 864 being a small tier in between, up to 1,000 square feet on our largest lots. And that's for your use allowance. That means you can only have that much use if you're on that lot size, no matter what. So you can split it up between 2 floors if need be, 300 square feet below, 300 square feet above, but you're not allowed to exceed that square footage of GFA. That also aligns with our building footprint size, which, you know, helps to keep this size of the building, the massing, sort of in appearance accessory to the primary. So it's limited as far as how big you can build it visually, but we want to ask the question if these two should align. Currently, it's the same exact limitation across lot sizes. You'll see that both of them match. But we want to ask the question if these thresholds are right. Should we move the use allowance up a little bit? Should there just be this one threshold between a 7,000 square foot lot or not? That is to say that the minimum potential square footage allowance for an ADU could be 864 citywide, regardless of your lot size, and then a much larger unit up to 1,000 square feet beyond that large lot size. This starts to become an issue, you know, looking at the popularity, how many lots would be affected. About 23% of our single unit lots are less than that 6,000 square feet. So yeah, 23,000 parcels could potentially build a larger ADU, something that's maybe more livable, a better option. It starts to become an issue if we get to this point of, you know, we're making all these other changes to create livable square footage. And if you're moving to a 2-story ADU where you can get 650 square feet above, so thinking about our smallest lot sizes citywide, you can get 2 stories, 650 above. You would technically not be allowed to have any of that, you know, ground floor be part of that ADU use. So if you're trying to provide a bit of a garage floor area as well as an ADU floor area and sort of maximizing out your footprint, so the structure at the rear would be a 650 footprint, which would actually bump you up to more square footage than your allowance. You're sort of forced into the scenario where you need an exterior stairwell or something that wouldn't count towards your ADU floor area. So that's where we have the question, is the 650 threshold too low? Should it move up? Do we see the need for larger, more housing options, more viable living options? Or is there a fear that we'll just get bigger, more expensive ADUs by heading this direction? Here's again looking at our potential proposal. So let's discuss.
Great. So I'm starting to see some notes in the chat. Do any of you want to just sort of verbalize what you're thinking about the square footage issue and possibly expanding it? Any unintended consequences? Yeah, Renee, please go ahead.
Thanks, Ryan. So my thoughts are that we already have a stacked pancake set of requirements that determine the size of an ADU, and we should not limit the size, not because I want huge ADUs everywhere, but let's let the lot size determine how big that ADU can be, so that setbacks are honored, height limits are honored, and that ADU can be as big as maybe a family needs it to be. And so, like, you know, a garage can be big. So a ground floor unit might be able to be bigger than a unit that's on top of a garage. Sorry, my dog's gonna be barking. And then the last thing I would say is the issue of being subordinate to the house. We really need to think about that, because there are neighborhoods where small houses have been built, have been built historically. And it's an equity issue if someone has a small house or a neighborhood with a lot of small houses and their ADUs all have to be smaller. So I think being behind and not on the street could be established as the factor determining that it's subordinate.
Thanks, Renee. There are a few comments in the chat agreeing, several. Ozzy, go ahead.
I think one way to think of this is that 650 square feet is a typical size for a 1-bedroom apartment. And it's really, really hard to do 2 bedrooms in that space. And 860 whatever, that you could do a comfortable 2-bedroom in that amount of space. It feels to me like Denver's got lots and lots and lots of 1-bedroom being built. But if we want ADUs to be things that families could live in, then this would be a good change to make.
Thanks, both of you. Others? Renee, did your hand go back up, or is that just from before?
Nope, it's not back up. Sorry.
No worries.
That's right. Yeah, I think I agree, with Renee. We do have lots of limitations. And so, by us saying that you could possibly have up to 864, we know most lots, you're never going to get there with all the other rules, right? You're not going to see suddenly every ADU is 864 square feet. There's plenty of other rules that we all have discussed numerously, bulk plane, things like that, breaking up of spaces. And so it's just the idea that when the site conditions align, possibly 864 square feet of ADU use could be allowed when appropriate.
Is there anyone who has any concerns about this or unintended consequences that you might flag? I see Jenny's point about small ADUs being attractive to seniors who may be happy with a small low maintenance unit, but any other comments before we move off this topic, just to keep in mind? Okay, seems like there's a lot of support for this. So people may still want to chime in on this, but we did want to offer an opportunity for anything that was just sort of is on your mind as an issue that hasn't been yet addressed to flag it either verbally or in the chat. Because starting in September, the city is going to be starting to give you more of this draft text code language that reflects the proposals being discussed here with some of the caveats or compromises that some of you are talking about in terms of trying to find a middle ground. So anyway, that's what's going to happen in September. I think the city is going to do a little wrap up here of what they're hearing, but before we do anything else that folks want to flag. And I see another comment in the chat from Renee about square footage. Hopefully we've covered them because I think these issues were all the ones that were addressed by you all early on.
Yeah.
Sarah noted that the junior or second ADU on the property that was mentioned earlier is worth looking at. Anyway, there's more comments being put in the chat, but does anyone want to verbally raise anything here before we wrap up?
Yeah, Rosemary's got a good question about the average cost per square foot to build an ADU today. Does anyone on committee have a good figure for us to throw around?
I could touch on that a little bit. The one thing that we find with our company is it's really hard to base these ADUs off of a per square foot cost. Really, if you're going to build a 400 square foot ADU or a 600 square foot ADU, you're really not going to see that much of a difference. There's a premium you have to pay to get contractors there to do the work. Really, all of your initial costs with architecture, permitting with the city is all going to be the same, whether it's that 400 or 1,000 square foot ADU. So really, I think that we have to look at these more as kind of just an all-in cost rather than breaking it down to a square foot cost. It's just a really hard metric to use. When you're building something really under 2,000 square foot or 2,000 square feet, it's really a hard metric to use.
Thanks, Sarah. There was also a note in the chat here from Chelsea. It'd be interesting to sort of poll people who have permitted ADUs through the city and see what size they went with and would they have preferred something larger if it was possible, but that might be an interesting data point. Okay, well, that's really wonderful input and thoughtful input, everybody. And I think Abe, do you want to just take a minute or two and just sort of do a quick reflection before we talk about the open house and the issue identification report?
Sure. Yeah. So as usual, like really great discussion from the group and lots to think about. Certainly, not going to be able to summarize everything, but I think there was general support for most of the potential solutions we've discussed with some caveats. Owner occupancy, obviously, there were pretty strong feelings from a lot of folks that, we just need to address that and support the construction of dwelling units and make sure that they're not being removed, but also strong feelings, from a few others that the requirement might actually be helpful in some cases. And so we need to follow up with Suzanne, for example, on what she was seeing in Northwest Denver in terms of investors asking about buying properties to build ADUs, and also just get as much hard data as we can. For example, I think Portland has tried to do some studies because they've allowed non-owner occupied ADUs for some time now, and we'll just try to get all that information so we can make as informed a decision as possible. Suburban rules, I think it sounds like we're probably headed in the right direction. Sort of maybe a little bit of a new or slightly new idea that we ought to be kind of looking closely at the fact that you can already do a lot of lot coverage in suburban, and how flexible do we really need to be about ADUs? And the ADUs with row houses and duplexes, general support, but concern about some unintended form consequences, like Ozzy saying dwelling units disconnected from the public realm. I think that's what you were seeing, Ozzy, when you saw those, if it's just an addition on the back, it's those people have no outlet onto the street or the alley, and is that now just kind of a little bit slot home-like? So we can talk about that some more. And then I think we're headed, it sounds like looking at the right things for the maximum floor area. And overall, just the sentiment of more data from other cities, please. Absolutely. We'll do what we can. We do already know that we've been working on the ADUs with duplexes and row houses. What are other cities doing? We're having a hard time figuring it out. I think we're a little ahead of the curve on that one, actually, or it may just be that, some cities have kind of done what you could already do here now, which is well, if you want to do that, just try to rezone to some multi-unit district or something, and then maybe there's a path that's more flexible there. Or they, Portland, they've gone through a really comprehensive housing project where they've really created a lot of different options for the way that you could do housing in a really lower scale residential neighborhood. And what we're not seeing is this kind of in-between thing that we're looking at here, of just taking the interim step, or at least the step of saying, actually, let's see if we can find a really sensible way to allow them with a duplex or a row house. But we'll keep looking.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So Josh, you sent this report to everybody, I think yesterday, and you were going to touch on it and talk about the draft criteria for decision making that was in there. Want to go ahead?
Today, actually, I sent it late, but yeah.
Oh, it was today. Yeah, that's right. It was today.
Go ahead, Abe.
Yeah, and I can, I'll just keep talking, give Josh a little break.
Please, thanks.
So apologies, we're really catching up with the reports. We have a plan to produce a series of reports throughout the project, and we're pretty far behind on that. We're trying to catch up again, as I said. We've got a background report that actually came out before the committee even started its work last October. It's just issues kind of underpinning the project and some information on how our current ADUs work. Then there's the report that Josh sent to the committee this morning in draft form. It's pretty high level, but we're really just trying to tie a little bit of a bow around the phase of the project that we've already kind of moved on from with the committee, which is just that, summarizing all the issues. And so that report doesn't talk about the solutions that we've been talking about today. It only talks about the issues. And it's really kind of for members of the public or others to just get up to speed with where we are. It makes a draft issue identification statement that you see on the slide, which shouldn't be really a surprise to anyone here, pretty general. Then we put the issues into the categories you see in the list, impact on neighbors and community, for example, and just talks about, you know, what we've discussed previously. So we'd love you to read it since you've all been involved in that previous discussion, and let us know if there's anything that's really unclear that you think we got completely wrong about what issues were discussed. And then you can give us comments anytime, but anything we get by like a week from tomorrow, we could actually incorporate into the next draft, which we'll put that on the website. And we move on from there then to an alternatives report, which then we sort of catch up to this whole discussion of like, well, what are all the different potential solutions to look at and pros and cons? We summarize all of that in there. Everything then, all of that comes together into a strategy report where we then say, as staff, we think on the basis of all of that information, the consideration of alternatives, here's what we think a recommended strategy could look like. We'll discuss that with you. We'll have some public discussion around that, make revisions, and then that's basically our blueprint for the zoning amendment that we'll draft. So that's how those reports work together. And then sorry, I'm probably running out of time. I've got one more slide that comes after this that is just, you'll see at the end of the issues report, it's on the last page, this draft criteria for successful solutions. Hopefully it's not too confusing. This is like different from the issue identification statement. We just want to put out there that, you know, as we're moving forward, like trying to make the hard decisions about, you know, when there are multiple ways to go to address an issue, which thing do we choose, basically? And so these are like 4 ideas for how to think about weighing potential solutions. We think they should be effective, equitable, flexible, and predictable. And so, you know, for example, if there's, you know, in the effectiveness area, definitely the solution should be directly tied to addressing an issue. Ideally, it doesn't spill over into like addressing other things that we haven't talked about. And it's like the most finely tuned tool that we can come up with to address the issue. And then, you know, you'll see how the other criteria are described. And we'd certainly, you know, maybe we'll have a couple of minutes for questions about this now at Ryan's discretion, but otherwise just appreciate any of your feedback on this and how we describe this. And then as we move forward with the discussion, we'll bring this up again and see how we think all of the potential solutions kind of relate to these things.
Thanks, Abe. I think my suggestion would be that we wrap up, just because wanting to allow public comment, but that this is important in terms of these draft criteria. I think my sense is they reflect a lot of the things that many of you said early on in terms of principles that were important to you and are clearly important to the city. But I think it would be great to have all of you, you know, look at this, look at these criteria. I think the city is, you know, going to be interested in your input on them. And if there's anything that was missed or, you know, should be a factor in considering what the solutions should be. Please highlight it for the city or put it in the chat. And with that, I think, Josh, I think you're going to talk about the open house at this point, right? Before we talk about the September meeting, and then we'll open it up for public comment in a few minutes.
Yeah, we can move along since we're running low on time. But yeah, just a reminder of where we are. You know, we're well through the process here in August already, my goodness, but we do have that public meeting coming up. So just another glance at our calendar, wrapping up this alternatives phase and moving into the recommended strategies. But before we actually start to, you know, fully recommend those things, we want to hold that public open house and come back to the public and see where we stand, where, you know, staff is starting to lean towards some of these solutions. And so this will be August 25th, 4 to 6 p.m. at the Carla Madison Rec Center. That's the new rec center on Colfax. We'd love to have as many of you there as possible to help us answer questions. You're going to be sort of subject matter experts at some level, or at least hold conversations with the public with us. But it'll be an open house format, so we'll have stations with specific topics, going through some of these big 10 large ticket items that we're looking at, but having conversations with the public, talking about potential proposals or where we're leaning. I'll follow up and send out a sign up list just in case anybody can fully commit. Since it is open house format, there'll be sort of just time slots of when folks will be coming and going, and maybe if you guys can share what time you think you might be there to help occupy some of that space with us, it'd be great. But yeah, looking to check in with the public. It's a good point to do it. We're just past the halfway point, and so really want to hear that. Hopefully we're leaning in the right direction.
So Josh, it sounds like you'd like to have committee members come to the open house to be able to sort of stand at the different stations and help explain to attendees what you all have done, and that you'll follow up with a sign up sheet.
Yeah, not fully. I don't think you'll be stationed there as expected to be a staff member. We'll have staff members at each set of boards, but ideally, since it is more open house, it'd be great to have folks from the committee to participate in those conversations with the public. We'll have ways to receive feedback in person, but also virtually as well. So yeah.
Okay, so no one will be put on the spot, but they'll be there to chime in if you want.
It's not a job per se, but
just fun.
But yeah, definitely helps to have representation there, and so the public knows that you guys do exist besides on the screen.
Okay, great. Perfect. And yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and then moving into the next meeting, it'll be September 1st. We'll start to look at some of those solutions after the public open house. We'll have a little bit more feedback about where we're headed, and so we'll start to look at some real concrete proposals. We'll start to issue a little bit more of that draft code language, that little bit that you got to see today, but definitely some more specific solutions. So we're on the lookout for that.
And Josh, I'm seeing in the chat that a few of the committee members have really useful resources, and others are asking if they could see them. And I just wonder if, like Renee and Naomi and others, if you have resources like that or links to them, if maybe you could share them with Josh and he could make them available to other committee members in his follow-up. That, yeah. I mean, my guess is many of you will be interested in those.
Certainly.
Okay, great.
Good share.
Okay, so before we just go to the audience, the members of the public, to see if anyone has any questions. First of all, if you do have a question and you're in the you're attending this Zoom, please put your hand up, and that way we can call on you in a second. And also, I think just a reminder that in addition to the public open house, people are always able to look at the website, and there's office hours and links to provide questions and request information. And is there anything else that you want to say about how people should get in touch with you if they have questions? Did I cover it?
Yeah, that's the easiest way. I mean, you can directly reach me via email. My email's on the website, everything there.
Okay, awesome. All right, I think we're just going to turn to the public, the folks who are still here. Do any of you have questions or comments in the last couple of minutes here that we've allotted? And I see Ozzy's hand is up, so we can go to Ozzy too.
Yeah, sorry. I promised the neighborhood home tour people that I would promote our ADU home tour. August 27th in the Baker neighborhood, we will have 6 ADUs for people to tour. Some are historic, some are new, some are in the landmark context, some are out of it. Go to bakerhometour.org.com. Let me see here.
And it's in the chat too, right? From earlier in the meeting?
Yes, but I wanted to make sure the attendees could find out too. It's bakerhometour.com. That's all. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you. We'll put that in the meeting summary also, Ozzy, so that people can see it if they log on that. I don't see anyone's hand up. So folks who are attending, any comments or questions that haven't been addressed already in the Q&A? Oh, David, I think you can go ahead. I think we can hear you, David. Go ahead.
You can hear me?
Yes, we can.
I guess my only question, I wasn't at the June meeting, and I was wondering if you guys had presented anything comparable to what you presented today, where you actually had the zoning code for, an S context lot. If you've done anything similar to that for like prospective changes, where that still hasn't been done for like the, urban and urban edge neighborhoods.
We haven't yet. We haven't released any potential, draft solutions. We're still receiving that feedback from that meeting. So yeah, we've heard a lot about height concerns, setbacks, ball plane height, and things like that. And so they're all things that, yeah.
Okay. And then my only other comment, and I brought this up a while ago, and I think it was brought up by architects as well, is that there's value in having some sort of porch situation on a second story ADU, and sort of like defining what can or can't be done, and figuring out, like, to me, there are obvious reasons not to have it face towards another lot. Like it could face towards the alley or towards the main house. If I build an ADU for my mom to live in, like I don't really have a problem with her porch facing my house. But I guess that's the only other thing. Everything else that I saw today and that it seems like you've heard from everybody, I'm excited to see where this moves. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks. We definitely heard that interest as well from the architects group, the idea of allowing decks or some sort of balcony, but yeah, also being mindful of the privacy concerns that are associated with that. So yeah, figuring out that proper balance, I think, for the appropriate context will be key.
I think to me, the most useful thing might be the difference between a deck that sticks out versus an internal porch type situation where somebody has outdoor space, but it's effectively inside what would normally be the building envelope. Because it happens all the time with apartment buildings and condo buildings. And it both protects the outdoor space and also makes it less obvious to others.
Yeah.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah,
thank you so much. So also I see that Abe just put a link to a Denver Post article with some disclaimers. All right, well, I think we've come to our conclusion, everybody, tonight, and we're a minute early. Thank you so much. Great work, everybody. Thanks for the great contributions, and we'll see you in a month. Yes.
We're very grateful, and hopefully we'll see you sooner than that at the workshop or the open house. Sorry.
The open house, yeah.
Yes, watch for follow-up from the city. See everyone soon. Feel free to come off mute, say goodbye if you want.
Thanks a bunch.
Bye. Thanks, guys.
Good night.
Bye, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.